The bitter winter wind howled across the Montana plains as Mason Barker urged his horse through knee-deep snow. The year was 1879, and the early February blizzard had swept across the territory with unexpected ferocity, turning the landscape around Clifton Hill into a treacherous white wasteland. Mason pulled his sheepskin coat tighter around his broad shoulders, squinting through the swirling snow as he followed the frozen river that would lead him home. "Just a bit further, Thunder," he murmured to his stallion, whose breath billowed in white clouds. "We'll be warm soon enough." Mason was returning from a long cattle drive that had taken him farther north than he'd intended. At 32, he'd spent most of his adult life working the ranges of Montana Territory, building a modest ranch just outside Clifton Hill. He was respected as one of the most capable cowboys in the county, known for his quiet strength and unwavering sense of justice. The howl of the wind suddenly gave way to another sound, faint but unmistakable, a cry for help. Mason reined Thunder to a halt, listening intently as the sound came again, weaker this time, carried on the bitter wind. He turned his mount toward the river, scanning the white expanse for any sign of movement. That's when he saw a dark shape against the white snow near a break in the ice. A carriage had overturned at the river's edge, one wheel jutting skyward like a monument to disaster. Mason spurred Thunder forward, his heart pounding as he drew closer. The carriage was half submerged in the frigid water, its team of horses nowhere to be seen. Mason dismounted quickly, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached cautiously, mindful of the treacherous ice. "Hello," he called out. "Anyone there?" A weak moan answered him from inside the overturned vehicle. Mason waded into the icy water without hesitation, the cold biting through his denims as he reached the carriage door. With strength born of urgency, he wrenched it open. Inside, a woman lay crumpled against the far wall, her traveling cloak soaked and her face pale as the snow around them. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins, framing a face that, despite its current distress, struck Mason as hauntingly beautiful. "Madam, can you hear me?" he called, reaching for her. "I'm going to get you out of here." When she didn't respond, Mason worked quickly, carefully extracting her from the wreckage. Her skin was frighteningly cold to the touch, and her breathing shallow. Hypothermia had clearly set in, and Mason knew he had precious little time. He carried her to Thunder, who stomped nervously at the scent of fear and cold. With practiced movements, Mason mounted his horse while cradling the unconscious woman against his chest, then wrapped his coat around her as best he could. "Hang on, madam," he whispered, though he doubted she could hear him. "My place isn't far." The ride to Mason's ranch seemed interminable, the woman's body growing heavier in his arms with each passing minute. By the time the outline of his cabin appeared through the swirling snow, Mason's arms ached, but his determination never wavered. He'd seen men and animals die from the cold. He wasn't about to let this woman become another victim of Montana's merciless winter. Inside the cabin, Mason worked with swift efficiency. He laid the woman on his bed, built up the fire until the room blazed with warmth, and gathered every blanket he owned. Her clothes were soaked through, a deadly condition in such cold. With professional detachment born of necessity, he removed her sodden garments and wrapped her in dry blankets, taking care to preserve her modesty as much as the dire situation allowed. For hours, Mason sat beside her, replacing cold compresses on her forehead with warm ones, coaxing her to swallow tiny sips of warm broth when she seemed close to consciousness. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the cabin, a different kind of battle was being waged, one against the icy fingers of death itself. It was near dawn when her eyelids finally fluttered. Mason, who had dozed off in the chair beside the bed, jerked awake at the sound of her soft moan. He leaned forward, watching as awareness slowly returned to her face. Her eyes opened a striking shade of amber that caught Mason completely off guard. Those eyes focused on his face with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke words that would change the course of both their lives forever. "I dreamed of you," she said, her gaze never leaving his. "I dreamed you would come." Mason stared at her, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected statement. "You're safe now, madam," he finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You're at my ranch about 5 miles east of Clifton Hill. I found you in the river." She tried to sit up but winced with the effort. "The carriage. The ice broke." "Easy now," Mason cautioned, gently easing her back down. "You've been through an ordeal. Rest is what you need most." "My name is Abigail," she said, her voice growing slightly stronger. "Abigail Porter." "Mason Barker," he replied with a nod. "Most folks just call me Mason." "Thank you for saving my life, Mr. Barker." Her eyes held his for a long moment before closing again, exhaustion clearly overtaking her. Mason watched as she drifted back to sleep, her breathing steadier now, her face no longer bearing the alarming pallor of before. Something stirred within him, a protective instinct stronger than any he'd felt before, mingled with curiosity about her strange first words. What had she meant about dreaming of him? The storm continued for 3 more days, effectively trapping them in the cabin together. As Abigail regained her strength, Mason learned that she had been traveling to Clifton Hill to take a position as the town's new schoolteacher. At 26, she had left her home in Boston seeking independence and adventure in the West. "My parents thought I'd lost my mind," she told him on the second evening as they shared a simple supper of venison stew. "Father wanted me to marry the son of his business partner, a perfectly pleasant man with the personality of damp paper." Mason smiled at that, finding himself increasingly drawn to her quick wit and the determined set of her jaw when she spoke of her ambitions. "Teaching children suits you better than being some businessman's wife." "I believe we're put on this earth to follow our calling," she replied, her amber eyes serious. "Mine is to teach, to open young minds to possibilities beyond their circumstances." She paused, stirring her stew thoughtfully. "What about you, Mr. Barker? What called you to this life?" Mason considered the question, unaccustomed to speaking about himself. "The freedom of it, I suppose. The honest work. A man stands or falls by his own efforts out here." "And yet you didn't hesitate to help a stranger," Abigail observed. "Not everyone would have risked their life in that river." Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with her praise. "Any decent man would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," she said softly. "True decency is rarer than gold in this world." The following day, as Abigail's strength continued to return, Mason found her standing at the window, watching the snow fall with a pensive expression. "Something troubling you, Miss Porter?" he asked, pausing in his task of mending a bridle. She turned, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "I was just thinking about what I said when I first woke. You must have thought me delirious." Mason set the bridle aside. "About dreaming of me," she nodded, her fingers twisting together. "It sounds so peculiar when spoken aloud, but it's true. For months before leaving Boston, I had the same dream repeatedly, a man on horseback finding me in a snowstorm. I never saw his face clearly, but I knew he was my salvation." She laughed softly, embarrassed. "My mother would say it was just nerves about the journey." "And what would you say?" Mason asked, surprisingly invested in her answer. Abigail met his gaze steadily. "I would say that some things in this world can't be explained by reason alone. Sometimes the heart knows things before the mind does. The simple honesty of her words struck Mason deeply. He'd never been one for superstition or fancy, preferring the tangible realities of ranch life to lofty ideas. But something about Abigail Porter challenged his pragmatic view of the world. By the fourth day, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts and crystal-clear skies. Mason knew he should make arrangements to take Abigail into town, but found himself inventing reasons to delay. Her company had brought an unexpected warmth to his solitary cabin. "I should check on the neighboring ranches," he told her over breakfast. "Make sure everyone weathered the storm all right. Then tomorrow, I'll take you into Clifton Hill." Abigail nodded, though Mason thought he detected a hint of reluctance in her smile. "Of course. You've been more than generous with your time and home already." Mason spent the day riding to the nearest properties, finding all his neighbors intact if somewhat snowbound. When he returned to the cabin at dusk, he was greeted by the unexpected aroma of fresh bread. Abigail had discovered his meager stores of flour and yeast and transformed them into a golden loaf that made his mouth water. "You didn't have to do that," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "I wanted to," she replied simply. "It seemed a small way to repay your kindness." That night, as they sat before the fire sharing the bread with honey from Mason's beehives, a comfortable silence fell between them. Mason found himself studying her profile in the firelight, the graceful curve of her neck, the thoughtful set of her mouth. She was unlike any woman he'd ever known, educated but not pretentious, gentle, but with an inner strength that had helped her survive the river's icy embrace. "Tell me about the school in Clifton Hill," he said finally. "What do you know of it?" Abigail brightened at the question. "It's quite new from what I understand. The town council decided it was time for a proper school rather than the informal arrangements they've had. I'm to teach children from 6 to 16 all in one room," she smiled. "It will be challenging but worthwhile. The town's growing fast," Mason agreed. "Lots of families settling now that the railroad's coming through." "And what of you?" she asked. "Do you ever go to town, or are you a complete hermit out here?" Mason chuckled. "I manage to be civilized enough to venture in for supplies once a month or so. Might even have been spotted at a social or two over the years." "A regular man about town," she teased, her eyes sparkling. The morning they were to leave for Clifton Hill dawned bright and cold. Mason had prepared the small sleigh he kept for winter travel, lining it with furs and blankets to keep Abigail warm for the journey. As they set out across the snow-covered plains, the sun glinting off the white landscape was almost blinding in its beauty. "It's like a different world," Abigail marveled, her breath clouding in the crisp air. "So vast and untamed." Mason glanced at her, struck by how right she looked sitting beside him, her cheeks pink with cold and her eyes bright with wonder. "It grows on you," he said simply. "Gets in your blood somehow." The ride to town took longer than usual with the deep snow, but Mason found himself wishing it could stretch on indefinitely. When the buildings of Clifton Hill finally came into view, a strange reluctance settled over him. In town, Abigail would begin her new life, and their unusual interlude would end. Clifton Hill had evolved from a mere trading post to a proper town over the past decade. It now boasted several streets of businesses, a small church, and the new schoolhouse at the edge of town. Mason guided the sleigh past curious onlookers toward the town's only hotel, the Antler Inn. "Word travels fast," he murmured as he noted the stairs. "Reckon news of the new schoolteacher's arrival is already making the rounds." Abigail smoothed her borrowed dress nervously. "I must look a fright." "Hardly the dignified first impression I had hoped to make." "You look fine," Mason assured her. though fine hardly captured the quiet grace she possessed even in his too large coat and hastily mended dress. At the hotel, they were met by the proprietor's wife, Mrs. Whitman, a bustling woman with keen eyes that missed nothing. "You must be Miss Porter. We'd nearly given up hope when you didn't arrive on the stage last week, and Mason Barker, as I live and breathe, haven't seen you in town since before Christmas." Mason tipped his hat awkwardly. Miss Porter had some trouble on the road. Her carriage went through the ice during the storm. I happened upon her and brought her to my place until the weather cleared. Mrs. Whitman's eyebrows rose dramatically, but to her credit, she made no comment about the propriety of the situation. "Well, the Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? Come inside, Miss Porter. We've kept your room ready, and I'll have a hot bath brought up straight away. The school board will want to meet you as soon as possible." As Abigail was whisked away, she glanced back at Mason with a look that contained both gratitude and something more complex regret, perhaps, at their parting. "Thank you again, Mr. Barker, for everything." "My pleasure, Miss Porter," he replied, suddenly aware of how empty his cabin would feel without her presence. Over the next 2 weeks, Mason found himself inventing reasons to visit town. He needed supplies, he told himself, had business with the blacksmith, wanted to check when the next cattle auction would be held. But each time, his steps inevitably led him past the new schoolhouse where Abigail had begun teaching. Sometimes he caught glimpses of her through the windows, moving among the students with animated grace, her face alight with purpose. Once, she spotted him as he rode past and raised her hand in greeting, her smile sending an unexpected warmth through his chest despite the February chill. It was during one such visit to town that Mason encountered Sheriff Tom Miller outside the general store. "Heard you played hero during that last storm," the sheriff said, nodding toward the schoolhouse. "Miss Porter's become quite the topic of conversation around here." Mason shifted uncomfortably. "Just happened to be in the right place. Lucky thing for her." The sheriff eyed him knowingly. "She's made quite an impression already. Half the eligible men in the county seem to find reasons to visit the school these days." Something like jealousy flared in Mason's chest, surprising him with its intensity. He'd never considered himself a possessive man, but the thought of other suitors circling Abigail stirred an unfamiliar protectiveness. "She's dedicated to her teaching," he said neutrally. Sheriff Miller chuckled. "No doubt, but even dedicated teachers need company now and then. The widow Johnson's hosting a social this Saturday, whole town's invited. Might be worth showing your face if you've developed an interest in education." The idea of a social normally would have sent Mason riding for the hills, but this time he found himself considering it. The chance to see Abigail in a setting beyond his rescue, and their snowbound days together, was unexpectedly appealing. Saturday evening found Mason uncharacteristically nervous as he approached the widow Johnson's house, where lanterns glowed invitingly, and the sounds of a fiddle drifted into the cold night air. He'd bathed meticulously, trimmed his beard, and donned his seldom-worn good suit, feeling somewhat foolish for his efforts yet unable to do otherwise. Inside, the widow's spacious parlor had been cleared for dancing, and it seemed half the county had indeed turned out for the occasion. Mason's eyes immediately sought Abigail, finding her across the room deep in conversation with Reverend Hayes and his wife. She wore a simple dress of deep blue that complemented her chestnut hair, which was arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. When she laughed at something the Reverend said, the sound carried across the room to Mason, stirring something in his chest. As if sensing his presence, Abigail looked up, her eyes widening slightly when they met his. She excused herself from the Reverend and made her way through the crowd toward Mason. Mr. Barker, she greeted him with genuine warmth. I didn't expect to see you here. Thought I should make an appearance, he replied, suddenly conscious of how rough his hands looked compared to the gentleman in the room. See how you're settling in. Very well, thank you. Her eyes searched his face. The children are wonderful, eager to learn despite having had such irregular schooling before, and the town has been most welcoming. Glad to hear it, Mason said, wishing he had more practice at small talk. You look, well. A hint of color touched her cheeks. As do you. I've hardly recognized you without snow in your beard. The fiddle struck up a lively tune, and couples began to form for a country dance. Mason hesitated, then took a breath for courage. Would you care to dance, Miss Porter? Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I'd be delighted, Mr. Barker. Mason was no accomplished dancer, but he knew the steps well enough not to embarrass himself completely. What he lacked in grace, he made up for in the attentiveness with which he guided Abigail through the figures of the dance. When their hands met, he felt an electric awareness that seemed reflected in her eyes. I've been meaning to visit, she said as they circled each other, to see how Thunder is faring and to thank you properly for your kindness. No thanks necessary, Mason replied, and Thunder misses you. Keeps looking at the door like you might walk back in. Only Thunder, she asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. Mason met her gaze steadily. The cabin's too quiet now. The simple honesty of his statement hung between them as the dance continued. When the music ended, Mason reluctantly released her hand, only to find another partner eagerly claiming her attention, a well-dressed man Mason recognized as Harold Finch, who owned the town's largest dry goods store. Throughout the evening, Mason watched as Abigail was sought out by various men, each clearly enchanted by the new schoolteacher. She was unfailingly polite to all, but Mason noticed that her smile never quite reached her eyes except when she glanced his way across the room. As the evening drew to a close, Mason found himself by the punch bowl, considering his departure when Abigail appeared at his side. Would you mind escorting me back to the hotel, Mr. Barker? She asked. It's grown quite late. It would be my pleasure, Miss Porter, he replied, unable to suppress the satisfaction he felt at being chosen for this task over her other admirers. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars speckling the vast Montana sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. They walked in companionable silence for a moment before Abigail spoke. I've thought about our time at your cabin often, she said, her voice soft in the still night. Those days seem almost like a dream now. A good dream, I hope, Mason said. She nodded, her breath clouding in the cold air. Very good, though I still wonder about the dream I had before, the one that seemed to foretell your coming. She glanced at him. Do you believe in such things, Mr. Barker? Premonitions? Mason considered the question seriously. Never gave it much thought before. But I've seen things out on the range that can't easily be explained. The way a herd knows a storm's coming hours before any cloud appears. The way some horses sense danger before it shows itself. He looked down at her. Maybe people have those instincts too, just buried deeper. They had reached the hotel, but neither seemed eager to part. Abigail turned to face him, her expression earnest in the moonlight. When I was in that river, feeling the cold taking me, I wasn't afraid, she said. Because somehow I knew someone would come, that you would come. She hesitated. I know how that must sound. It sounds like faith, Mason said simply, and I'm glad for it if it gave you strength. Abigail smiled, then surprised him by reaching up to touch his cheek gently. Good night, Mr. Barker. I hope I'll see you again soon. Count on it, Miss Porter, he replied, his skin tingling where her fingers had brushed. As winter gave way to spring, Mason found himself drawn to town with increasing frequency. Sometimes he would arrive just as school was letting out, offering to help Abigail carry books or supplies. Other times, he'd bring small gifts, wildflowers that had emerged from the melting snow, or honey from his hives that he knew she favored. Their friendship deepened with each encounter, conversations flowing more freely as they grew comfortable with one another. Mason shared stories of his life as a young cowhand, learning the ways of cattle and horses from old-timers who'd been on the frontier since before Montana was a territory. Abigail told him of her childhood in Boston, the daughter of a successful merchant who had expected her to make an advantageous marriage rather than pursue education and independence. "Father was convinced I'd come running home within a month," she confided one Sunday afternoon as they walked along the now thawed river where they had first met. "He's likely composing letters even now listing all the suitable bachelors still available if I'd only return to civilization." "And would you?" Mason asked, his heart constricting at the thought. "Return east," Abigail shook her head firmly. "Never. This place, the wildness, the freedom of it, it's everything I hoped for." She looked up at him. More, actually, the warmth in her eyes gave Mason courage. "Miss Porter Abigail, I'm not a man of many words, but I'd like to call on you properly if you'd allow it." Her smile was radiant. "I'd like nothing better, Mason." As spring blossomed into summer, their courtship became the talk of Clifton Hill. Mason took Abigail on picnics in the meadows as wildflowers painted the landscape in vibrant hues. He taught her to ride properly on a gentle mare he'd trained especially for her. She introduced him to poetry and shared her dreams of expanding the school as the town grew. Not everyone approved of the match. Harold Finch, still nursing his disappointment, remarked loudly in the saloon one evening that Abigail Porter could have done better than a rough cowboy with dirt under his nails and more cattle than conversation. When the comment got back to Mason, he merely shrugged. "Man's entitled to his opinion." "It doesn't bother you?" Abigail asked when he related the incident. "Only if it bothers you," he replied honestly. She laughed, her eyes dancing. "Mr. Finch fails to understand that I prefer honest calluses to soft hands that have never known real work." By midsummer, Mason had begun construction on an addition to his cabin, a proper bedroom, and a small study where Abigail could prepare her lessons and keep her beloved books. He worked on it in the evenings after tending to his ranch duties, driven by a vision of a future that grew clearer with each passing day. One warm August evening, as they sat on the porch of his cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson, Mason reached for Abigail's hand. "I'm not a wealthy man," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Can't offer you the kind of life you might have had back east, but everything I have, this land, these hands, my heart, it's yours if you want it." Abigail's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she squeezed his hand. "I dreamed of you," she whispered, echoing her first words to him. "Not just before we met, but all my life. A man of honesty and strength who would see me for who I truly am." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "Yes, Mason Barker, I wanted all the land, your hands, your heart. And you shall have all of mine in return." Their wedding took place in September, when the aspen trees had turned to gold and the first hint of autumn crispness touched the air. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the schoolhouse decorated with wildflowers and ribbons. Even Harold Finch sent a handsome set of dishes as a peace offering. Abigail wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her chestnut hair adorned with mountain blossoms. Mason, standing beside Reverend Hayes in his best suit, thought his heart might burst with pride and joy as she walked toward him on the arm of Sheriff Miller, who had volunteered to give the bride away in the absence of her father. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, but Mason hardly heard the familiar words, lost as he was in Abigail's radiant gaze. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, spoken in voices steady with conviction. When Mason slipped the gold band onto Abigail's finger crafted by the town's jeweler from gold, he'd panned himself from the creek on his property. Her smile outshone the autumn sun. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Hayes declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with dancing and feasting under a canopy of stars. When the time came for the newlyweds to depart, they rode together on thunder back to the ranch that would now be their shared home. At the threshold of the cabin, Mason swept Abigail into his arms, carrying her across in the age-old tradition. Inside, the fireplace blazed welcome, and fresh wildflowers stood in a jar on the table. Mrs. Whitman's doing, no doubt, when she'd come earlier to prepare the house for their return. "Welcome home, Mrs. Barker," Mason said, setting Abigail gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Home," she repeated, leaning into his embrace. "I've been searching for it my whole life, and here it was, waiting for me in the wilderness of Montana." Their kiss was tender at first, then deepened with the love and longing that had grown between them since that fateful winter day. As husband and wife, they discovered each other anew, their union blessed with a passion born of true connection of heart and mind. Life settled into a rhythm that suited them both. Each weekday morning, Mason would drive Abigail to the schoolhouse in town before tending to his ranch duties. In the afternoons, he would collect her, often lingering to help her organize books or prepare the next day's lessons. The children adored Mr. Barker's visits, especially when he could be persuaded to demonstrate rope tricks or tell stories of cattle drives and frontier adventures. As autumn deepened into winter, they marked the anniversary of their unusual first meeting. Mason surprised Abigail with a small wooden box he'd carved himself, featuring an intricate design of river and mountains. "For your treasures," he explained as she ran her fingers over the polished surface. "My greatest treasure isn't something that can be contained in a box," she replied, kissing him softly. That winter proved milder than the previous one, but on the anniversary of the day he'd pulled her from the river, a snowstorm blew in, keeping them homebound. They sat before the fire, wrapped in a quilt Abigail had made, reminiscing about those first days together. "Did I ever tell you that my father was furious when I wrote to tell him I'd married a cowboy?" Abigail asked, leaning against Mason's chest. "Can't say as I blame him," Mason chuckled. "Probably had visions of his educated daughter living in some dirt floor shack with a wild man." Abigail laughed. "He's coming around. His last letter only mentioned your unfortunate choice twice, which is progress. Mother's more curious than anything wants to know if you really wear those dreadful leather things with fringe all the time." "Wait until they hear they're going to be grandparents," Mason said, his hand gently caressing the slight swell of Abigail's abdomen. "That ought to give them something new to fret about." Abigail covered his hand with hers. "Mother will be on the first train west, I guarantee it. She won't be able to resist." The news of Abigail's pregnancy had been met with joy throughout Clifton Hill. The school board had been understanding about her need to take time away after the baby's birth, arranging for a temporary replacement teacher, but assuring her that her position would be waiting when she was ready to return. "You think it's a boy or a girl?" Mason asked, as he often did during their quiet moments together. "A boy," Abigail said confidently. Strong and steady like his father, Mason shook his head. "A girl with her mother's brains and beauty." The baby, a son they named Thomas James Barker, arrived in early May with Mrs. Whitman serving as midwife and half the town pacing anxiously outside. He had his mother's amber eyes and his father's determined chin, a perfect blend of them both. Mason's hands, so capable with horses and cattle, trembled when he first held his son. "He's so small," he marveled. "But perfect," Abigail said tiredly from the bed, her face glowing with exhaustion and joy. As Thomas grew, so did the ranch and the town. Clifton Hill was now firmly established on the railroad line, bringing steady growth and prosperity. Mason added a herd of sheep to his cattle operation, a diversification that proved profitable in the changing economy of the territory. Abigail returned to teaching when Thomas was 8 months old, now with an assistant who had been one of her first students in Clifton Hill. She began working on establishing a proper library for the town, writing to her connections back east for book donations and organizing fundraising events. Their life together was not without challenges. A particularly harsh winter in 1884 threatened their livestock. A fire nearly destroyed the expanded schoolhouse in 1885. Mason's father passed away in Pennsylvania, leaving him with regrets for the relationship they'd never fully mended. Abigail suffered a miscarriage that left them both grieving for the child they'd never know. But through it all, their bond only deepened. They faced each trial together, drawing strength from the unusual connection that had brought them together that snowy day by the frozen river. By the time Thomas was 5, he had a sister, Elizabeth Ann, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. The family was complete, their home filled with laughter, books, and love. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Mason surprised Abigail with a journey not back east as she might have expected, but to a hidden valley he discovered during a cattle drive, where a natural hot spring bubbled up from the earth, creating a warm pool even in the midst of winter. "How have you kept this secret all these years?" Abigail marveled as they soaked in the steaming water, the mountains rising majestically around them. "Been saving it for a special occasion," Mason replied, watching the firelight play across her features, still as beautiful to him as the day he'd pulled her from the ice. 10 years, she mused. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you found me in that river. Other times, it seems I've known you forever." "Maybe you have," Mason said, thinking of her dream. "Maybe some souls recognize each other, no matter when or where they meet." Abigail moved through the water to sit beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I used to wonder if I was foolish, leaving everything familiar to chase some vague dream of purpose in the West. Now I know I was just finding my way to you. And I was waiting, though I didn't know it," Mason replied, wrapping his arm around her. "Every trail I rode, every season that passed, all of it was leading me to that river on that day." Under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, they renewed the promises they'd made a decade earlier, their love deeper now for having been tested by time and trial. The years continued to flow like the river that had brought them together, sometimes rushing with events, sometimes meandering peacefully. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who combined his mother's love of learning with his father's affinity for the land. Elizabeth developed into a spirited girl with dreams of becoming a doctor, inspired by the frontier physician who had tended the family through various illnesses and injuries. Mason's hair began to show strands of silver, and fine lines appeared at the corners of Abigail's eyes, but to each other, they remained as they had been on that fateful day, the strong, gentle cowboy, and the brave, dreaming woman he had pulled from the icy water. Clifton Hill grew into a proper town, boasting a brick schoolhouse, a small hospital where Elizabeth would eventually fulfill her dream of practicing medicine, and a library that bore Abigail's name in recognition of her tireless efforts to bring books and knowledge to the frontier. On the 25th anniversary of their meeting, Mason and Abigail stood together on the banks of the river where he had found her. The winter day was cold but clear, the ice on the river glinting in the sunshine. Their children, now grown, had organized a celebration in town, but the couple had slipped away for this private moment of remembrance. If that carriage hadn't broken through the ice, Abigail mused, if you hadn't heard my cry for help, I would have found you some other way, Mason said with certainty. Maybe in town or at a social, our paths would have crossed. Because I dreamed of you, she said, smiling up at him. Because we were meant to find each other, he corrected gently, pulling her close. Some things are just meant to be. As they turned to head back to town, where friends and family waited to celebrate with them, Abigail paused for one last look at the river. Thank you, she whispered to the flowing water, now peaceful beneath its winter coating. For what? Mason asked. For being the beginning of our story, she replied. And for teaching me that sometimes dreams do come true, just not always in the ways we expect. Hand in hand, they walked away from the river that had nearly claimed her life, but had instead given them both a love that had sustained them through the years, a love born in the most unlikely of circumstances, yet as natural and necessary as breathing. A love that had been dreamed of, and then found, against all odds, in the wild heart of Montana.